And again, we're here in part to celebrate Michael Waltz's pioneering and path-breaking work in this area. It's to talk about one of the central doctrines of just war theory and also of the laws of armed conflict that I think finds its most powerful and eloquent articulation in Michael's book, which is the doctrine that there is an equal and symmetrical set of rights and obligations that apply to soldiers, combatants in war, and that apply to both sides of a war, both to those fighting within the context of a just war and those fighting within the context of an unjust war. As many of you will know, this position of combatant equality has come under very sustained philosophical attack in the last number of years. And the position that I have sought to adopt and to defend, thank you very much, is one that I call restrictive asymmetry. So we can think about these ideas of the combatant rights as having two components. There are a set of duties or requirements or restrictions that combatants are under, most centrally, of course, the requirement never to intentionally target non-combatants or civilians. So a set of restrictions. And then there are also a set of rights or permissions. The most central of those, of course, is the right, the liberty, to intentionally target enemy combatants. And it seemed to me that when you think about the traditional symmetrical configuration of rights, that traditional articulation is half right, but also half wrong. So it seemed to me that the part that's half right is that the restrictive component is actually correct. There are a set of restrictions, most centrally, once again, involving the prohibition on targeting non-combatants, that are equal and apply to all combatants in all conflicts. But that the permissive side of it is not. Right? That the permissions of conflict only attribute to those who are fighting within the context of an operation or a war that is genuinely justified. And I think that that has important practical ramifications. At the very least, I think it means that soldiers, ordinary soldiers and combatants, have an obligation to think carefully and conscientiously about the justification of the operation, the war that they are being asked to participate in. It seems to me also that this ought to have certain ramifications for the way that we think about configuring international law and international criminal justice. Not that I think that it would be appropriate or even possibly appropriate at some point in the future to have mass war crimes prosecutions against ordinary soldiers for the crime of aggression, but it does seem to me to be extremely important to think about ways that we can build recognition of the fact that combatants who participate in unjust wars are doing something wrong. That does seem to me to be a very important objective. Now, I'm going to be using the mode and methodology of modern analytic philosophy, which means that I am going to be talking about and considering a certain number of hypothetical cases. And I know that many people have a kind of allergy to this way of thinking about ethics. And I have to admit that it's an aversion that I do share. Right? The sense is that these topics are so important and so grave. There's something inappropriate and perhaps misleading about thinking about these kinds of very contrived philosophers' examples. As I say, I do feel some sympathy towards that. I think that the appropriate way to think about that is always to recall what we're using these devices for. Right? We're using them as an attempt to try and understand certain foundational underlying mechanisms and principles. And it's those that really have to be at the forefront. It's not simply a matter of trying to find the cleverest configuration of judgments that will fit around these rather strange cases, but it's when these cases are used appropriately, they might point us towards certain underlying justifiable principles. But it's those that have to be the focus. So what then are those principles that I think we ought to be focusing upon in these cases? Well, to me, there are a number of ways of kind of entering into this debate, but for me, the preferred way of entering into it is to begin by thinking about the idea of universal human rights. And in particular, the idea that there's a certain core subset of human rights that are the most central and important negative rights of persons. So I'm thinking about rights such as the right to life, the right to be free of torture, the right to be free of rape and other forms of sexual abuse, certain forms of liberty rights against arbitrary detention, and certain kinds of core rights against certain kinds of core property rights against having one's property arbitrarily seized. And to me, the great question when we think about the ethics of war is how and to what extent our understanding of the ethics of war can be made to be consistent with our best understanding of those rights, of the protections that they guarantee to persons, and of the ways that those rights can sometimes be lost or forfeited or abrogated. Now, I think we can't assume at the outset that this project is in fact possible. Right? It may well be that it's not, in which case one might be tempted either towards some kind of pacifist position or towards some kind of radical constraint or constriction or demarcation of the zone under which we're willing to accept that rights operate and function. But at least at the outset, I'm going to assume that that's not the case. That it's constitutive, it's part of our idea of what rights are and what they do, is that they apply to all persons and they apply in all contexts. Right? There's no particular get-out-of-jail-free card that one has with respect to these very basic rights when one is engaged in a situation of war and conflict. But when we think about it in those contexts, there are certain requirements or necessary components of that kind of account operating. Right? It's not simply the fact that we are preventing a certain kind of harm. It's that the person against whom we're using defensive force is at least minimally morally responsible for a harm that is itself unjust. Right? So there are two components of that claim. One is that the harm you're seeking to avoid is actually an unjust harm, and the other is that there has to be some kind of minimal responsibility. Why is that? Well, think about ordinary cases where somebody is involved in justifiably inflicting harm. Right? A victim of a rape attack is defending herself with force, perhaps lethal force, against her attacker. She's now threatening the attacker. We wouldn't think normally that the attacker gains a right, a permission, to kill the rape victim in self-defense. Why? Well, because the use of force was itself justified. Why might we think that it's important to be responsible for the threat that one is delivering? Well, this is to take account of certain rather unusual, but I think recognizable cases where one's body may be involved in threatening, in a sense, another person in a way that has nothing to do with our agency. So an example of this might be cases of physical coercion, right, where somebody might literally take your body, perhaps take your body and throw it against another person, move your hand bodily against your will in a way that threatens the life of another person. Now there's a sense in which you're involved in the causal process of producing harm to another person, but it's not through any aspect of your agency. And I and a number of other philosophers have argued that in cases like that, one doesn't lose any of one's human rights. One has to be responsible for the unjust harm or threat that the defensive action is intended to avert. So all of that, I think, is what underlies the, as it were, the restrictive component of that position that I laid out at the outset. That's why I think it's the case that combatants who are involved in an unjust war operation, a war of aggression, a war of ethnic cleansing, of genocide and so forth, cannot claim the equal war rights of killing enemy combatants, at least insofar as those combatants are doing no more than appropriately exercising the defensive rights of their state or of that threatened community. They would be analogous to the rapist attempting to claim a right of self-defense against the harmful defensive actions of their victim. But, this is where it gets interesting. Some philosophers have said, well, if it's a necessary condition in order to be liable to defensive force that one is morally responsible for some kind of unjust harm, if that's a necessary condition, as I'm suggesting it is, then perhaps it's also a sufficient condition. Right? Maybe you can become liable to defensive harm simply by being morally responsible for some kind of unjust harm to another person. And maybe you can become liable even when you are not yourself currently involved in posing that harm. Right? Now that, of course, starts to suggest a line of argument that would very quickly erode the idea of equal protection for civilians in war. Because there are many civilians who have a certain degree of moral responsibility for the unjust harms that are being threatened, for example, by the army of that state. And if it's the case that moral responsibility for an unjust harm is sufficient to be liable to defensive force, then it might look as though it can be permissible in certain circumstances to intentionally target enemy civilians. Now, I find that view very, very troubling. What I'm going to try and address in the remainder of my remarks is to show why I think we should resist very, very vigorously that extension of the idea of moral asymmetry. Pardon me. Well, why might one think that moral responsibility is sufficient? So here's an example that my good friend and colleague Jeff McMahon from Rutgers University often gives to kind of enter into this way of thinking about it. He says, well, look, imagine that you're the mayor of a small town in the south of America, and this town has been run by a corrupt sheriff. And you come in as the new mayor, and you're about to clean up the town and thereby threaten the position of the sheriff. And so the sheriff wants to get rid of you. So what he does is he gets a young, impressionable, not too smart farmhand from one of the local farms. And he tells this farmhand all kinds of lies about the mayor. He tells him that, he's going to come and do these terrible things. He tells him that, he's really the only one who can stop him, and he can only stop him really by killing him. He fills his head with all of these crazy fantasies. And so now here you are, the mayor riding into town, and there's this young farmhand who's been partly coerced, partly simply misled by this devious sheriff. And the farmhand is taking out his gun and making to shoot you, the mayor. And you see that you could defend yourself either by killing this farmhand, but you also see that there's a sheriff there, kind of standing nearby. You guess that the sheriff has had this kind of awfully manipulative role. And you kind of think also that if you shot the sheriff, thinking about the Bob Marley song now, if you shot the sheriff, this farmhand would feel himself released from his obligation, and you could save your life. So you could save your life either by shooting the farmhand, who is, at the very least, he has mitigated responsibility for the harm that he's posing towards you. But he's the one that's actually posing the harm, right? He's firing the gun. Or you could target the sheriff, who is genuinely responsible for it. But, here's the rub, he is not actively involved in currently, directly posing the threat towards you. Who ought you to kill? Well, McMahon says you ought to kill the one with greater responsibility. That ought to be the principle, right? Target the one with greatest responsibility for the unjust harm. And then he makes the second move, of course. He says in cases like war, it's often the civilians who look like they're standing in that role of the mayor, right? They're not the ones actually holding the gun, but they're the ones in some sense who may be ultimately responsible. Now, I have to say, just in fairness to McMahon, that he's very, very quick to point out that in almost all cases, civilians will not be appropriate targets because of considerations like necessity, of proportionality, of prospect of success. In most real-world cases, it will not be justifiable to target the civilians, even if they're responsible, because it won't be necessary, it won't be proportionate, or it won't have a prospect of success. But nonetheless, he thinks that there are imaginable and potentially real cases where it may be the morally required thing to do, to target the morally responsible person who's not currently posing a threat. Think about the following kinds of cases. Let me just start off with one that is equally absurd and contrived as the one that McMahon starts off with. So here you are, walking down the street one day, and a criminally insane psychopath leaps out and starts to attack you. He's criminally insane, so under law he would not be considered to have responsibility for the attack that he's making on you. Why is that psychopath wandering around the street? Well, he's wandering around the street because the Minister of Health culpably and fraudulently, in full knowledge of the likely consequences of his actions, embezzled all the money out of the mental health budget of the state, as a consequence of which all the hospitals housing dangerous psychopaths had to be closed. They were then expelled onto the street. So here's this man now wandering around the street, endangering your life and attacking you. Now, it just so happens that wandering by, as they often do in these philosophical examples, is the minister himself. Okay? And you can defend yourself either by returning fire and shooting and killing the psychopath, or you can grab the minister and use him as a human shield against the psychopath. Now, so here we have a case where the one morally responsible for the unjust threat that's facing you is not the direct, immediate threat, but someone else. In this case, I take it, it is, at the very least, much less clear that you would be entitled to use the minister as a shield. And perhaps it's the case that you ought to kill the psychopath, even allowing for the fact that his responsibility is deeply, deeply mitigated. Another example. Let's say that you are attacked by a culpable aggressor, tries to kill you but fails, but nonetheless inflicts a very significant wound on you. The wound festers. A year later, your organ is about to fail, resulting in your death. The only person who can provide a replacement organ happens to be the culpable aggressor who attacked you 1 year ago. I take it that most of us believe that it would not be permissible, or if it would be permissible, certainly not permissible in the same terms that it would be permissible to kill a current aggressor, but it would not be permissible to kill the past aggressor, harvest his organ, place it into your body, and save yourself. Again, a case where moral responsibility for an unjust harm doesn't seem to be sufficient for liability to defensive force. Or take a much less contrived and kind of crazy philosophical example. Let's say that you're being attacked by somebody with a knife-wielding aggressor. And again, imagine there's someone with very diminished responsibility, perhaps someone who's criminally insane, and you could save yourself by using as a human shield the cutler who made the knife. He made the knife knowing that there was a risk that his product would or might be used by an aggressor in that sense. Again, it seems crazy to think that simply because there is minimal moral responsibility for the unjust threat, that there might be potential liability to defensive harm. Okay. So all of these cases, to me, suggest that there is something deeply wrong with that formulation of the moral responsibility principle, the one that we find in thinkers like McMahon. Right? That the right way of thinking about liability is that it really has two necessary conditions. Right? Some kind of minimal moral responsibility is a requirement. That moral responsibility has to be for a harm that is itself objectively unjust. Right? It can't be for a harm that is justified either as an act of self-defense or proper law enforcement or for any other reason. That has to be there. But an additional necessary condition is going to have to be something like that the person or persons one uses defensive force against are themselves currently involved in posing or delivering that threat. And there I take it to be very close to the articulation that we actually find within the laws of armed conflict. Right? In the laws of armed conflict, the specification is made in terms of those who are directly participating, right? Directly participating in in combat operations. Now that seems to me to be the kind of the right way of demarcating it, but that's very different from giving what I kind of gesture towards at the beginning, which is some kind of principled explanation, right, of why those and only those persons ought to be appropriate targets of defensive force. So partly by way of moving towards that, let's consider right at the outset some immediate problems, okay? So I suggested, well, there are these two components, two necessary conditions, moral responsibility for an unjust harm and some kind of direct participation clause. Well, look, here are some immediate problems. There are problems of principal-agent relationships. So let's say that I want to get rid of a nasty colleague of mine, and so I hire a criminal hitman to go and knock her off. And again, imagine it's a case where my colleague was able to defend herself by using me as a human shield, for example, or using me in some other form. It doesn't seem objectionable that she would be able to do that, right? Even though I'm not the one literally pulling the trigger, there's some kind of involvement there that seems to potentially at least make me potentially liable to harm. Or perhaps in a kind of extended sense, military chain of command. Right? We believe that all uniformed personnel involved in combat functions at least, sorry, that's probably too general, but all uniformed personnel who are not involved in medical or chaplaincy functions are liable to harm within war, including those very high up the chain of command who are definitely not driving tanks or firing weapons, and those that are kind of further up the logistical chain of command as well, right? We believe that all of those are potentially appropriate targets, not simply those that are pulling the triggers, right? So again, there's a problem there. Or again, cases of criminal conspiracy, right, where I'm involved in a gang, we're all involved in some dangerous criminal enterprise. I'm not actually the one who is, holding the knife or pulling the trigger, but I'm fulfilling some other important task of that collective criminal enterprise. Maybe I'm driving the getaway car. Again, we normally think that liability extends to those cases, even though we might, it's not the immediate direct cause. Okay, so these I take it to be the kind of the problem cases. So our specification of the principle is going to have to be sufficient to rule out the kind of Cutler cases, the Minister of Health cases, but not to exclude these kinds of very ordinary, everyday cases, principal-agency relationships, chain of command, criminal conspiracies, and so forth. Well, how can we think about doing that? Well, I think one important thing to observe at the outset is that all of these cases that I've just indicated, the Hitman case, chain of command, the conspiracy case, and the duress case, these are all cases of what I want to call strongly unified intention, right? Now, I mean by that two things. First are cases where, as it were, one person is acting through another person, right? Is instrumentalizing that person's action. So this is obviously the agent-principal relationship, right? The hitman is acting on my behalf. He is carrying out my will. A very similar story, I think, exists within institutionalized chain of command settings. Preeminently, of course, within military organizations, right? There's a sense in which the higher command acts through the chain of command. It acts through subordinates within that chain of command. So there are these cases of acting through, and then there are cases of the strongly shared commitment to violent collective projects. Right? Cases of criminal conspiracy where there is a shared commitment to certain kinds of violent or wrongful outcome. Now, what I think that this points us towards is that when we're specifying, what I am proposing is the second necessary condition for liability, this condition that has something toward, it's kind of something about the direct threat that one is posing. When we're thinking about specifying that condition, it has to be understood explicitly in these intentional terms, right? Whether you are a threat in the relevant sense will depend upon the intentional stance that one has with respect to that threat. And the direct delivery of threat has to be taken to include these cases of what I'm calling strongly unified intention, cases of acting through and other cases of shared commitment. How am I doing for time? I think that specification intuitively draws the boundary in the right line. It draws the boundary line in the right place. It doesn't draw it exactly in the way that we have traditionally been used to it. It would, for example, I think, make civilian leaders within the military chain of command also liable to deliberate attack, right? You think about the US president, commander-in-chief, is a civilian, but within that chain of command. On this way of thinking about it, that shared intentional position within this institutionalized arrangement would be sufficient to be making him a potential target in that sense. But I think it draws it in the right place, in places where it deviates in that way. I think that it's appropriate that those that are genuinely within chain of command, even if they're not wearing a uniform, ought probably to be considered to be potentially legitimate targets. Well, I still think that there is a level of explanation required to be given here. Okay. I've indicated that I think that we need to draw the distinction somewhere around this place. I think that's the right place to draw it. But I think that I still haven't made good on the promise, I'm not sure I am going to be able to make good, of giving a deeper grounding of why. Right? Why liability to harm ought to be limited to those cases of direct threat, including this kind of extended cases of unified intention. Now, there are two possible ways of providing that explanation that I think might be doing some of the work here. I probably only have time to talk about one of them. The first one that I probably won't say anything about is something that a number of other people in this room have recently been doing some very interesting work on, which is on the idea that there's a distinction between certain kinds of harmful or intentionally harmful agency, which are often referred to as eliminative and manipulative agency. And the idea is that there is something worse about using a person, manipulating a person in the sense of using them for your benefit in order to achieve some good. There's something worse about that than simply removing a person or their property from the environment or set of factors that are currently threatening you. And I think that may be, something like that may be playing a role here. It certainly seems to be the case that the paradigm cases of self-defense are cases of elimination, right? You're eliminating a person whose actions or body is part of the threat that one is facing. Whereas in these kind of paradigmatic cases where we don't think defensive action is appropriate, think about cases like the cutler who made the knife that's now being used against you, or the minister. These are paradigm cases of manipulating a person, right? Using a person for your advantage, an advantage that you wouldn't be able to get if they were not there on the scene at that time. Now, we know that it can sometimes be the case that when action results in harm for a certain person, but only because of the intervening action of another person, that responsibility for that harm can sometimes be mitigated. And it seems to me that there's a potential principle here that might be helping to explain what's going on, that would say something like this. When two or more persons contribute towards an unjust threat, to yourself or to a third person, you're entitled to use appropriate defensive force against the person who poses some kind of minimal threshold of responsibility and whose intervening action is most proximate to the unjust threat. Right? So in the case of the minister and the psychopath, we have two agents, one of whom is much more fully responsible, right? The minister is responsible in a much more full sense because the immediate threat is laboring under a mental illness. Nonetheless, he would probably pass the minimal threshold of being liable to defensive harm on his own, right? I mean, if this was just a psychopath who was wandering around, even with that diminished responsibility, the responsibility is probably sufficient to make him liable to defensive harm. But his agency is much more proximate, right? He is the one that is much closer in the chain of causation and the delivery of this harmful threat. So he's the one that ought to be targeted in preference to the person who is more fully responsible, but further down this causal chain. I think that the minister case is a helpful one because it helps us to realize that insofar as we do recognize something like this principle of intervening agency, it's not simply a principle that works by pointing to considerations of responsibility. Right? It's not simply the case that intervening agency is diminishing or mitigating responsibility for the more distant cause. Because in this case, we've already recognized at the outset that the more distant cause is the one who has greater responsibility. Right? He was consciously, negligently, culpably responsible for embezzling the money, whereas the proximate cause has very, very minimal diminished responsibility. So if I'm right about this assessment, it's not simply because of effects on responsibility. It's something else going on here. Well, this proposal is going to face problems and challenges of its own. At the very least, it has to be specified in a way that takes into account this point about unified agency, right? Because we're going to have to say something like, in cases where more than one person are involved in delivering an unjust harm, target the most proximate agent that passes the minimal responsibility threshold, except for those cases of unified agency, right? Except in cases where it is an agent-principal relationship, as in the Hitman case, except in cases where there are strongly institutionalized chain of commands, as in a military, except in cases of criminal conspiracy. So there's going to have to be this very significant exemption there. And that, of course, is going to place great demands on what I suggested needed to be put in place there, this account of the intentional character, the intentional nature of threat. And I think it's an open question as to whether that burden can be sustained. But I do think that it has some plausibility, right? I think it has some plausibility even in the cases like the one that McMahon presents us with the sheriff and the mayor. It seems to me to be a significant part of what's going on in delivering the intuitions that McMahon thinks that case will deliver to us. That there is this kind of strongly unified intention between the sheriff and the farmhand, right? It's not insignificant, it seems to me, that the sheriff is a public official with some kind of presumptive deputizing power. It's in the fact that the farmhand is carrying out the will in something that looks analogous to an agent-principal relationship. As soon as we weaken those bonds somewhat, we say it's not the mayor that you could kill to save your life. Sorry, you're the mayor. It's not the sheriff that you could kill, but for example, someone from the community who voted for the sheriff. Even if he voted for the sheriff when the sheriff was running on a kill the mayor platform, right? As soon as we take it outside the domain of these very strong institutional or conspiratorial or agent-principal unities of intention, we make it something much more plastic, much more ambiguous, like a voting context. Our intuitions that the liability extends that far becomes radically diminished. So as I say, I think there is some plausibility within that suggestion. I think there is some plausibility within the eliminative manipulative agency suggestion. I think that a lot more work needs to be done in both of those cases. But I think that some principle underscoring some kind of demarcation along the lines that I've suggested here has to be determined, because I think that the alternative is simply not compatible with some very deeply held data of moral intuitions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.